And Walker here with Sherdog.com. This is the Sherdog.com post-fight show. We are backstage in the Honda Center in Anaheim, California, where UFC 241 just wrapped. Daniel Cormier no longer the UFC heavyweight champion. Stipe Miocic reclaims his crown with a fourth-round TKO. So, joined by the homies once again, Submission Radio, Dennis and Casper.
Three of the Back Fist boys in the house.
For real, we squad up.
Behind the camera, a new honorary member.
Yeah, so Matt Hunter behind the camera, we squad up. You know, this is what we're doing. So gentlemen, pretty interesting main event. I mean, I'll start with you, Casper. Like, what were your feelings in watching Daniel Cormier get knocked out the way he did?
Just quickly, it's crazy seeing these guys when you sit cage side and they're just slinging leather. They're so close. Just exchanging punches. You could see the blood flying from Stipe's face as Daniel Cormier was hitting him. And it looked like Daniel Cormier was, well, I'm not going to say coasting to victory, but it looked like he was going to get the decision. And then Stipe sort of comes out and adjusted the game plan, went to the body. And we've seen DC have problems with the body for years and years and years. John Jones hit him with some bad knees. Anderson Silva hurt him to the body. Frank Mir, even back in the day in his first UFC fight. So I'm almost surprised sometimes that people don't take more advantage, and that's not a bigger and more crucial part of their game plan. But it's pretty amazing to see Stipe adjust kind of mid-fight, use that tactic, and use that to earn him the victory tonight.
It was such a bizarre fight because it looked like Daniel Cormier was just, like you said, on cruise control. Yeah. That he was coasting through and had this one on lock, it seemed to him. That first round was dominant. I saw some 10-8 scores being thrown around on social media, and it just seemed like he just kept picking up steam. Stipe was just out here a second ago. His face looked battered. Yeah. You know, amazing to think that he lost the fight considering what he looked like. So, Dennis, do you think this was finally the night that Cormier got old, or?
I think it's the night where Cormier got overconfident more than old. I mean, look, he looked great out there. To me, he didn't look old, he didn't look slow, he looked very similar to the normal Cormier, but whenever you have your hands down and whenever you mess around with the guy the way the Cormier was doing with Stipe, whenever you think that a guy like Stipe can't hurt you, and I was talking to Dan Hardy after the fight, and what I said was it was kind of like a flip of the first fight. The first fight, Stipe didn't think DC could hurt him, came in there, got caught, went down. In this fight, DC was getting hit with Stipe's punches. He thought, and we've all been, anyone who's sparred before and been hit before has realized you get into a level of comfort where you're rolling with the punches and you realize that if this guy hits me, it's not a big deal. He got a little bit too comfortable there and it cost him the fight. I don't think he looked old. I don't think he looked bad. I think he looked quite good, definitely a lot better than the Derek Lewis fight. But unfortunately, this is the game that we're in. And what we saw was a guy putting his guard down and another guy showing his heart. Two big factors in the fight.
You know, I think one thing, too, to take into consideration is, while we do know Daniel Cormier to have a really good gas tank and he embraces the grind, as his phrase goes, he always takes some time off during a fight. Yeah. You know, and most famously, the first Jones fight, probably, I think that, I want to say it was the fourth round, where it looked like he took off and he never was able to regain any momentum from there. Yeah. And I kind of feel the same thing happened this time, that he almost took that time off. And this is as Stipe is getting a little more success, as Cormier's defense is getting a little sloppier, and he's taking more shots. And it just looked like the perfect storm of, you know, how to lose a fight that you're winning. And at the post-fight presser, we had some people mention that this was the biggest significant strikes landed by the losing fighter in UFC history. 118, I believe the number was.
Yeah. It tells a story in a lot of ways that obviously Daniel Cormier was in control of that fight before he wasn't.
Yeah, and also don't forget this. Just going through DC's history, a lot of guys in Stipe's position kind of gave up. I don't want to say like an Anthony Johnson and, you know, all these guys that he's fought before at light heavyweight and defended the title against gave up. But there came a point in the fight where DC was pushing the action, dominating. They were in the same position as Stipe, but they decided, you know, to fold a little bit. They got choked out. They gave it their back. The fight's finished. Here, Stipe stuck in it. He believed in himself. We saw after the first round, he was like, all right, go the second round. That didn't go his way, and then he was able to capitalize. So I feel like we need to focus on the fact that DC made a mistake, but also we can't not give credit to the fact that maybe Stipe is one of the few people that could stay in there with a DC that absolutely dominates him for the first few rounds and then has the ability to come out and actually land those strikes and finish that fight. How many people can you think of in the heavyweight division or light heavyweight division that could do something like that? I think it's a credit to Stipe what he was able to do, and it's just the fight game.
I'm glad you mentioned that because we shouldn't lose sight of what Stipe Miocic did. He avenged the loss and he regained the title, did it in epic fashion, a tremendous comeback, and he is the statistically speaking, he's the greatest heavyweight champion the UFC has ever seen.
Yeah.
So he gets to reclaim that status. So now, moving forward for him, what are these options looking like? He's gotten one over Ngannou again, but I'm sure a lot of people might be interested in that rematch to see if Ngannou has improved his wrestling defense. There, Blago Ivanov's out there. There's some guys that those names aren't sexy necessarily, but what is left for Stipe right now? Are we hoping that John Jones moves up now?
To be honest with you, I think there's a lot of fire behind this Francis Ngannou fight, and I think that unless the UFC pay John Jones a shitload of money, I think he's pretty happy to stay sort of, taking out these light heavyweights. I think he wants to renegotiate his contract, and the quicker he fights out this first contract, the quicker he can renegotiate and get into a better contract. So to be honest with you, I don't think we're going to see John Jones versus Stipe maybe anytime soon, at least not until next year, maybe mid to late next year. And I think the UFC is very high on Francis Ngannou, and historically they haven't been as high on Stipe Miocic. So I feel like they might put together this Ngannou rematch in hopes that Ngannou beats Stipe so that they can have this super marketable champion.
All right, so before we get off of that, we do have to make note of this could be the last time we see Daniel Cormier. So just for a second, let's pay a little tribute to what we've seen. And what do you think the legacy that Daniel Cormier leaves behind, if this, in fact, is the last time he steps in the octagon?
Yeah, I think Daniel Cormier has an incredible legacy. Not only he was able to achieve such dominance at a later stage in his career and a later age, but he was able to do it in a way where he never sort of dodged anyone. He took the fights that the UFC gave him. He was definitely a guy that was always backing himself no matter who the UFC put him up against. I think many people in a situation would have taken easier fights. I think many people in a situation wouldn't take a Stipe rematch. I think many people in a situation would have just tried to have big money fights. This is a guy that fought Anderson Silva at UFC 200. This is a guy that really just went out there and put on a show for the fans. And this is a guy that was remarkable in the back when it came to things like doing media, when it came things to like being a role model, when it came things to being a great teammate, a great captain, eventually a great commentator, a guy that can break things down, a guy that can sort of approach things from a heartfelt sort of angle, but break it down from his previous experiences. So I don't think we'll ever see another DC in MMA. I think he's a very, very rare specimen. He's someone, if he leaves after this fight, there's nothing wrong with it. I think he's got 100 million opportunities, and I wouldn't want to see him come back just because, he wants a paycheck or just because he doesn't want to go out on a loss or something like that. The only way I'd want him to see him come back is if he has the passion to fight. If the passion's gone, if he's not feeling like it's there, and you've got all these gigs and you're not the same physically, if it's taking you 6 weeks of losing weight just so you're able to train properly, if your body is killing you, you know what I mean? Why not go out on an epic fight like that? He was still dominant. He still showed a lot of heart against a guy that's considered to be one of the greatest heavyweights of all time, and it's still 1-1. So it's an unanswered question that people can debate for the future.
And just to add to that, I think that, like Dennis mentioned, he does own a win over Stipe. And if Stipe goes on to be an even more dominant champion and rack up, an incredible amount of more title defenses, it only kind of adds to DC's legacy that, hey, he beat this guy at one point.
Right, especially if he gets that streak going, and Cormier will be known as the guy who interrupted what that streak could have been.
Yep.
So we'll put the topic to bed just after this one last question, and just make it real quick, gentlemen.
Yeah.
So Stipe 3, Jones 3, retirement. Which would you rather see?
I like the Stipe 3. I think there's a lot of heat to it. I'm a big fan of this Anthony Joshua Ruiz fight because I think now that Joshua's lost, there's so much excitement for the next one. Well, going into the Stipe fight, everybody thought DC was going to destroy him, and he was beating him for the longest amount of time. So I think there's going to be big demand in seeing who walks away from this feud as the winner. That's good. I think the Jones fight, I don't know where I'm at with that, To me, even though he looked good in this fight, I know that he's had a lot of issues behind the scenes. He's older. He's got issues with his body. I don't know if I want to see him go up against a guy like John Jones and get absolutely destroyed, possibly in an octagon as his final fight. I don't want to see him get the head hits. I don't want to see him get the knockouts. I almost feel like it's not a great fight for him at this stage. Whereas with the Stipe fight, I still find it very interesting. It's very competitive. I think with a couple of changes to his game plan and strategy, that fight could change completely differently. And I think with Stipe coming in, if he changed a couple of things that fight, so there's big question marks for me. I wouldn't mind seeing what happens there.
I'd like to see the John Jones fight, to be honest. I think if you talk about motivation, if you ask DC, what are you more motivated, to beat Stipe again, a guy you've already beaten, or Jones, a guy you've never beaten? I think the motivation factor is there. And DC spoke to us a lot about legacy and how that's important. And I know Dennis sort of thought, I think you think it's more about the money, and I think a lot of us think that as well. But if you say, all right, let's say it is about the money, I feel like there's more money in a John Jones fight as well, as opposed to a Stipe Miocic third fight. I think with John Jones, not only do you get a really competitive fight, but you get a huge rivalry. John Jones is a bigger draw than Stipe. So I think if you combine legacy and the monetary motivation, I think that makes a lot more sense for Daniel Cormier.
But don't forget, certainly an opportunity for him to walk out with another loss to John Jones, a bigger blow to his legacy. Maybe more money in his pocket, or maybe less, depending whether or not he wins or loses. I mean, if he loses less money, pretty rough on his legacy. It's a big gamble. It just depends where he's at.
I feel the win is bigger, though. If he does beat John Jones, like if he beats Stipe again, it's like, well, we've already seen that. If he does go out and beat John Jones, that's like his white whale. The scofflaw, if we're making Seinfeld references.
All right, gentlemen. So let's move on from that. The co-main event, which a lot of people, at least from the sounds in the arena, it was the main event. Nate Diaz wins against Anthony Pettis, a very, I think, dominant decision. I didn't really see many moments where Anthony Pettis looked like he was in control. So, Casper, I'll start with you. Did it look like he took 3 years off?
I think Anthony Pettis had some good moments in that first round and certainly the first part of the second round. But I think for me, this was a reminder of just how good Nate Diaz is at just drowning guys and just putting that pressure on. And I thought that it wouldn't be something that we would see until the later rounds if there was, say, like a 5-round fight. But Nate Diaz was very good at sort of bringing that in early and just drowning Anthony Pettis. I think this fight kind of had everything. Not only did we see, a lot of stand-up, a lot of boxing. We saw Nate Diaz go to the clinch. We even saw a phenomenal ground battle, and that was something that a lot of people were curious about. Anthony Pettis versus Nate Diaz. We saw Nate Diaz on top of Anthony Pettis, obviously Pettis being really, really good off his back. We saw Nate Diaz controlling him. So we had a lot of answers as far as who was the superior fighter on the ground, standing, clinch. I thought this was a phenomenal performance by Nate Diaz.
I think it was probably his most complete performance. The fact that he didn't start slow, he came out there and right away kind of got to work and didn't kind of fall victim to some of those stylistic problems that he's habitually shown throughout his career. So Dennis, man, what's next for Nate, man? What do you want to see? Are you with Jorge Masvidal?
Yeah, man. Look, I'm here with the Masvidal thing because I think he can do Conor McGregor whenever. I do want to see that third Conor McGregor fight, but I think for now, I think the big money fight, the fight that everybody wants to see, is this Masvidal-Diaz fight. It overshadows the title. It overshadows whatever's happening with the championship. It's something on the side the UFC can utilize while they figure out the stacked division as it is. It's something that Masvidal wants. I think it's something that Diaz wants. I just hope the UFC can give Masvidal a deal that he's happy with, and I just hope we didn't take another 2 years between breaks with a guy like Nate Diaz. He seemed happy. He seemed like he was one of the best Nate Diaz's I'd say we've seen in quite some time. He actually looks good at welterweight now. Like his body looks like it's
filled out.
It's filled out. It's not just weight that he's put on. It looks like he's got muscle, and it kind of looks like he understands that maybe his career isn't going to be around forever. It looks like he's kind of making a run for it now. Not a title run, but more of a run for legacy cash, being able to utilize his name to the best of his ability. So we saw a bit of a different Nate Diaz. Like, it wasn't like a trash talking, Stockton slap, middle finger Nate Diaz. It was a happy Nate Diaz who was happy to hang out with the media, was happy to do post-fight presses, even though he got thrown some interesting questions that maybe he would have been annoyed at in the past. Got cold Nick, that kind of stuff. So I think we're seeing possibly the beginning of this new Nate Diaz who's going to have his most successful run yet.
And I think we need to note, too, that we saw a new Dana White he finally admitted that Nate Diaz is actually a needle mover. And really saying that he is possibly on par now with the Ronda Rouseys, with the Conor McGregors, with those big names that have always just drawn big dollars. So sky's the limit, looks like, for Nate. So a hell of a time to come back in a pretty entertaining division. And he also has the ability to go back down to lightweight. So,
absolutely,
yeah, it's fun stuff ahead for Diaz. But we got to talk about the fight of the night. Paulo Costa proves that he is, in fact, a true middleweight contender and wins a pretty closely contested decision against Yoel Romero. So, Dennis, how did you score that fight?
Man, it was crazy. You know, obviously you can't ignore the fact that Costa had heaps of success in it, but what I was more impressed with wasn't as much the success, but the fact that when Yoel pulled out all his tricks, Costa was able to survive and still win the fight. I mean, we've seen Yoel pretending to be tired. We've seen Yoel, acting like a bit of a,
And he was sticking his tongue out this time.
Sticking his tongue out. And every time he almost got back into that fight, Costa was able to hit him with a shot. Costa was able to put the pressure on him. Costa was able to put him back in that position where he was sort of fighting him off rather than fighting to win the fight. So that's crazy. The other thing that's crazy is he made Yoel Romero look small in that ring. And Yoel Romero is not a small guy. He's the guy from Street Fighter. He's the guy that we go, this guy is an unbelievable specimen. And Paulo Costa looked huge in that ring, huge in that octagon. So it was incredibly impressive. His chin held up great. He was able to do great work. There's obviously some things he's going to go back and improve before he fights for the title. I think there's areas there that he can definitely improve. He's got to be careful. He can't get drawn into these battles. He's got to be more strategic. But even though he was still able to win in those areas. The guy has great leg kicks. The guy has great strikes.
His shot selection was on point.
Absolutely. And he's also a guy that's super exciting. He's not afraid to get into these fire battles with people, and he's mentally strong enough not to go down to things that Romero throws out at you. So, man, what can I say? He has absolutely shocked me. I was wrong. I'm not afraid to say it. I thought Yoel Romero was going to win this thing, and by the way, again, we've got to give Yoel Romero credit because he got hit with some big shots, and he stayed in there, and there were parts where you thought, all right, here we go, he's going to win it. So you got to give Yoel Romero credit for it. He's incredibly tough at his age, and I still think he's incredibly, and that's why I wish he'd move up to light heavyweight, because I'd love to see him go up to light heavyweight and fight some of these other guys. But without a shadow of a doubt, Paulo Costa is going to be sitting in that front row at UFC 243, and he's going to be looking at his next opponent. And I know Robert Whittaker, Israel Adesanya are going to see him in that front row and go, oh man, what's the division become these days?
Yeah, he's going to be quite the sight sitting there cage side. All right, so Casper, the crowd was booing furiously at that decision. I wasn't a big fan of the booing necessarily. I understand it was a close decision. I think we need to stress that. What was your score?
I scored it for Costa, without a doubt. I was shocked. I looked at Dennis and I said, I don't really understand the booing. I think sometimes things can look differently on TV than they do cage side. I know we've sometimes been a victim of that. But I think seeing the way the shots landed, seeing sort of the blood flying from people's mouths and stuff, and like seeing these shots land up close, it's unbelievable how hard these guys were throwing. But I'm very confident to say that Costa won that fight. Like Dennis said, the way he wore those shots, that was something I don't think we really knew about him. Like, he took Romero's best bombs, lived to tell the tale, gave it back to him. He never stopped coming forward. He really was like the Terminator. So I guess we found out a few things about Paulo Costa. Sometimes when guys are going in there and they're just destroying guys and they're finishing them, you kind of think, well, what's going to happen when a fight does go to decision?
When you hit adversity.
And deep waters as well, And he was in those deep waters. He wore the shots. He pulled out the decision. Like Dennis said, he has to work on a few things. I think the cardio is going to be possibly a big factor if he goes into those 5-round fights against the Whittakers, Israel Adesanya, anyone in a title fight. But also the pace that he put on was pretty crazy, and maybe that's something that he's going to adjust in his next fight. I said this before, that we might be seeing sort of the birth of the new Brazilian superstar, incredibly marketable. Great rig, obviously. People are sort of talking about him and Arnold Schwarzenegger, because of the nickname. I think there's a huge amount of buzz around him, and I think there would have been more buzz if it wasn't for that suspension. And, if he was maybe... I feel like there's been a big rise in terms of the competition. You fought guys like Johnny Hendricks, Uriah Hall, and then all of a sudden, Yoel Romero...
there's no middle ground.
Yeah, exactly. People haven't had time to sort of get on board with the Paulo Costa, train the bandwagon. I think they will now.
Yeah, I don't think they have much of a choice at this point. All right, so that kind of wraps up the main talking points about this fight. But before we, call it a night, Just tell me your fight that you kind of wish got a little more attention, that you enjoyed from earlier in the card, main card, prelims, whatever. Start with you, Dennis.
Well, I mean, Sadiq had an amazing night tonight, and this is a guy that got a huge opportunity, a big pay-per-view on the main card, and he absolutely delivered. I mean, what can you say apart from the fact that this guy has had an incredible year? I mean, you go back a little bit, and he's not even in the UFC. Now this guy's on the main card of possibly one of the biggest pay-per-views of the year in UFC 241, in a perfect position where he got a finish in a division that doesn't get many finishes. I think Dana White is going to be behind him. He's absolutely killed it today, and I think he needs a little bit of light. It's good that you brought him up.
You know what? Oh, sorry, don't mean to cut you off, Casper. Just a note, too. I don't know if this came across on the broadcast since we were on the arena floor, but before he walked out, the Nigerian flag was on the big screen. And normally where they would have just show the fighter about to walk through the tunnel, a lot of his walkout was just the Nigerian flag on there. So the promotion is clearly behind him. They're clearly interested in what he has to offer.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, he's got the Nigerian, headband wherever he goes. I was going to say also Derek Brunson, really impressed with him pulling out a really gutsy performance, going through adversity early in that fight. Ian Heinisch catching him with some punches and a massive head kick early on, and Derek Brunson just wouldn't go away. And we sort of spoke about how a lot is on the line for him. He was a guy who at one point was kind of like talked about as a potential title contender, or at least a big player in the division. Had some adversity in his career, and this is kind of one of his last chances, and you could kind of feel that because he really did everything in there to get that win.
Ian can hold his head after a performance like that. I think we're going to see an even better Ian in the next fight. A guy like Brunson, incredibly tough, and Ian was still coming forward even though he had no gas left in the tank. So I think both guys walk away with something from that one.
Yeah, no quitting Ian Heinisch. He definitely made a very good showing for himself. Yeah. And for Derek Brunson, the maturity in what he did, that was the exact opposite of what we've seen Derek Brunson do in some of his worst losses. So the fact that he's now, has a much more stable training situation, that he's strategizing more and he's trying to clean up some of those holes in his game, there might be a second life there for Derek Brunson in the upper echelon of the division. So for me, I was particularly impressed by Corey Sandhagen. He did whatever he wanted almost to Rafael Assunção. And if you didn't believe it before, Corey Sandhagen is the real deal. And adding to such a stacked and entertaining bantamweight division, sky's the limit. I can't wait to see what he has next. All right, so once again, got to thank you guys for joining me for Fight Week for UFC 241. Appreciate company of my boys. We got to kick it. It's always a good time. So that's Casper. That's Dennis. I'm Ant Walker. You can go to Sherdog.com. You can go to Submission Radio and see all the latest about UFC 241, all the post-fight wrap-ups, all the articles. You know what to do with it. So you know what you got to do. You got to stay beautiful. You got to stay positive. And most of all, you got to stay sexy. I'll see you when I see you. Peace.
Four horsemen for life.